Hello everybody! I am so excited for this video because we are finally doing another calligraphy tutorial. I know I have been mentioning randomly to all of you who ask, I am so sorry, that it's gonna come soon. If you want to see the previous calligraphy tutorial I did, it was in Gothic textura quadrata style, which you can check here. But for today, we're going to talk about the #1 script that inspired my own calligraphy. And you will notice as soon as we get down to the paper to actually practice this style, it has a lot of similarities to this style of calligraphy that I do all the time in my Instagram here. I essentially use a mix of uncial and insular minuscule, which is another style that we may talk about another day. But first, let's go into the historical background of the uncial style. The uncial script started being used towards the very late 2nd century, primarily the 3rd century, until around the 8th century. However, its popularity started diminishing past the 6th century in favor of more embellished styles like artificial uncial and Roman half uncial, for example. But let's go back to its origin and how and why it became so insanely popular in Europe to the point of directly influencing pretty much every script that came later for the next hundreds of years. I would say everything until Gothic is inspired directly from uncial. Artificial uncial and half uncial, like I just mentioned, insular minuscule and majuscule, Carolingian scripts, all of these are just direct descendants from uncial script. Cue that cool family tree that I found on Wikipedia, so you can totally find it too. But I thought it was really cool how they do the arrows, kind of showing you an ancestor family tree of what came directly from what. And it all boils down to uncial and what we are about to talk about, Roman rustic. So, before the creation of uncial, there were two main scripts being used in Europe. Those were Roman square capitals and Roman rustic, also known as rustic capitals. Roman square capitals, we've all seen them. It's this. You've seen them in antiquity buildings in Europe. You have seen them when you type on your computer and Times New Roman and you put all capitals. That's basically this. So Roman square capitals was the primary script used in Europe at the moment, and the reason why it's so straight-lined essentially is because it was primarily used on stone. So if you're carving on stone, it's very difficult, or way more difficult, to do curved lines. It's much easier to just chip through in this way in a straight line, and hence why the letters were primarily favoring straight lines. However, when you bring that into paper, it is much more difficult for the human hand to do those straight, perfect lines than to do curves. Of course, we write naturally, we write in an angle, right? We don't write like this or like this. So recreating this style on paper took way longer than it really needed to take. Hence, Roman rustic. And why that became so popular, Roman rustic is still tall, still has a lot of straight lines. Even letters like the C's and the O's that are supposed to be very round, or that's the way we think of them, are still elongated and trying to imitate that longer, straighter pen stroke. Roman rustic became the more informal but still formal way of writing on paper. Roman square capitals were still the absolute formal. There are manuscripts that are all written like that, which is amazing to me. That must have taken so long, so excruciatingly, so much arthritis. So Roman rustic had become the standard for manuscripts. However, contrary to what was popular during the Middle Ages, manuscripts were still not primarily for Christian religious purposes. It wasn't until the late 2nd century that Latin became the official language of the church, and suddenly there was a very high demand for manuscripts, religious manuscripts in Latin in order to build those Christian libraries. So when you have essentially an entire library in an entire language to be built, you need to save in time as much as you can. So suddenly Roman rustic, even though was the better option, still was a bit too time consuming for what was needed. Hence why a more curved shape was favored. Now there are a couple more things that influenced the choice of changing what was the standard script. One of them is the writing surface. So up till now, the most popular writing surface was papyrus. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. which comes from the plant. And it was a much rougher surface. So when you have a rougher surface, it's more difficult to do curved lines. It's easier to go with the grain of the paper. You just do straight lines. However, vellum and parchment was starting to become popular, which is animal skin. And that has a much smoother surface. This is what you see when you look at medieval manuscripts or early Renaissance manuscripts in some of them. In museums, for example, they are all parchment or vellum, which has a much smoother surface, so suddenly you are able to have more liberties in terms of what kind of stroke you use. And then the final reason, and my absolute favorite, is the association that people had with Roman rustic. Now, because Roman rustic wasn't primarily used in religious manuscripts, what it was heavily used for was for pagan literature. So of course the Christian church wanted to do everything it possibly can to not be associated with pagan literature, hence why really they didn't want to use it. People already associated the script with this particular kind of literature. We need to steer away from that while not steering away too much so that people can still read it, of course. So Uncial is essentially a blend of Roman rustic. We still see some elements of Roman rustic. We see the, of course, the alphabet, the overall shape of some letters. You'll see that Uncial still maintains some serifs, which were very, very popular for Roman styles of writing, but then it is taking the curves that were already being very popularly used in Greece. Combination of the Greeks with the Roman rustic makes Uncial. Because of its popularity, it was used absolutely everywhere. And here is where I always say this. I said this in my previous video, I believe, and I'm gonna say it again. There is not one perfect way to write in Uncial script. There is not one perfect angle, there is not one perfect serif or tail of a letter, or because it was used everywhere, right? And it was used by so many penmen that it's going to change slightly. You look at extant manuscripts and pages, and they all look a little different. You can see some differences in some letters not so much. For example, O's are very round throughout the entire spectrum. But for example, R's, some people make the tail of the R way longer than others. Another difference that I have found is with L's. The bottom stroke of the letter L is actually varies quite a bit between one manuscript and the other. So what I am going to give you is a set of guidelines, let's put it that way. It is some sort of standard, which the way I have chosen which letters to use. I first started practicing this style with multiple calligraphy books and getting multiple people's opinion or take on what the style overall looks like. And then of course I compared it to actual manuscripts and made some small changes for it to look more similar to the manuscripts that I liked. So this is my hand, other people have their own hands, and you have your own. So if it doesn't look exactly the way I do it, that's okay. It's just a general set of guidelines on how to do the style. Another couple things I want to mention about this style before we start with the tutorial is this is a majuscule style. Minuscule styles were not a thing yet, which means all of the letters were capital letters. If somebody wanted to make a capital letter something bigger that would stand out to start a sentence, for example, or start a paragraph, what they would do is do the same letter, just bigger, with the same pen. There were instances where people would actually use the letter, the Roman rustic version of the letter in order to do the capital. With a majuscule script, you typically don't have a big difference between ascenders and descenders, ascenders being letters like D or B, descenders being letters like P or Q. However, with Uncial script, you start seeing a bit more of a difference between ascenders and descenders and the rest of the letters. It's not as obvious as with the way we write now, for example, but they're starting to peel away from the idea of every letter being the exact same height. One more thing I wanted to talk about is the origin of the name Uncial. Now, uncia in Latin means a 12th part. Now, that would usually refer to, for example, as a 12th part of a foot, which is an inch, right? So an uncia would often be a word to refer to an inch. The thing is, these letters are not an inch high. Actually, on the contrary, part of the purpose of this script, as we just talked about, was speed, and part of achieving that speed and saving on paper is to make the letters smaller. Roman rustic letters were far taller than uncial letters. Apparently, allegedly, Saint Jerome was looking at a manuscript, and I'm not going to quote it because I've actually found a few different translations of the quote, so I'm just going to paraphrase it. He essentially said, "Oh my goodness, you people using extravagant silver and gold inks for your letters and purple paper." Yes, that was a thing, purple paper. They would dye the vellum purple to make it more fancy. That was probably very expensive, but it looks really cool. Look at this. Anyway, back to Saint Jerome. He was criticizing the extravagance of these manuscripts, saying that it was essentially an abomination. And one of the things that he mentioned was these uncial letters, referring to uncial being an inch-long letter, implying that it takes way too much space and time. The funny thing is, uncial letters are not that big. So many people believe that he was actually looking at Roman rustic, but somehow throughout time, the belief arose that he was actually looking at an uncial manuscript. So what he was actually looking at, we will never know, but that's why this script is called uncial. But enough with the history, let's go over to the tutorial. I will be using a dip pen this time around, along with my medieval ink that I made in this video a few weeks ago. If you want to purchase the ink, by the way, I have it stocked again. It is for sale, it is available. Send me a message on Instagram. The bottles are 30 ml with a dropper cap, and it is 12 bucks each plus shipping. I would love to spread it around and have more people use it. But anyway, enough of that. Onto the tutorial. Alright, so for this tutorial I will be using a 2.5 sized nib. This is definitely bigger than what I usually use. What you see me use in my journal is usually 1.5, but when learning a new script, it's actually better to use a bigger nib than you usually would because it's less forgiving, of course. So if you learn it well on a bigger nib, then it'll be much easier to translate it to a smaller nib than the other way around. As for the size of the letters, this is a 4 to 4.5 pen width sized script. What I mean by that is the way to measure the script so that it's relative to the nib that you're using. We're starting off with one of the most useful and repeated strokes in Uncial Calligraphy, which is also just the I, the letter I. So essentially you start doing a slight serif from left to right, bring it down, and then finish off with a left to right serif in the bottom. This is a movement that we will use for about half of the alphabet. So moving on to the letter T, we're essentially adding the line on the top, but the vertical line of the T is the exact same as what we just did with the I. Similar situation, but actually a little flipped. With the B, we are starting the B exactly how we did the letter I, but then in the bottom we're doing a little change. You are extending that stroke to the right in order to connect with the round shape that starts on the second set of strokes for the letter. Something I want to mention is you'll notice that I'm not doing any exercise strokes on this video. I went directly to the actual letters itself. That's because you can pretty much take any stroke from any letter and turn it into an exercise, especially those that repeat themselves very often. For example, the letter I is perfect to just repeat and do drills with in order to practice the technique of this particular style. For the next group of letters, we are taking that I stroke and we are expanding it. So this is what I meant by Uncial starts to play with ascenders and descenders. So here we're using that stroke for ascenders. So starting a little over your pen widths, you start that same exact shape that you did for the I, but this time you're going to finish it with the letter H. Now if you notice, the second stroke of the H, so the curve to finish off the letter, starts in line with the pen widths that we did. Except for the original, the first vertical stroke, the rest of the H does stay within the pen widths. The same goes with the next ascender, which is the letter K. You do the exact same I stroke and then continue it with two curved strokes. For that second stroke of the letter K, you'll notice it does have that little serif on the bottom.
Our next ascender is the letter L, which also starts with this same vertical stroke that we've been doing, and you end it the same way you ended the B on the previous line, with that bottom left to right extension, except that this time you just leave it there and you're done with the letter. For the next set of letters, we are repeating that same vertical stroke, but this time diagonally. We are staying within the pen widths. These are not ascenders or descenders. Starting with the letter A, you'll notice the angle is about a 30-degree angle, and then finishing it off with the second stroke starting halfway through your measurements, moving towards the bottom line. When you move back up here, you want to use the left edge of the pen so that you get that thin line going up. The next letter is X, which starts with the exact same diagonal pen stroke, this time finishing it off with another diagonal on the opposite way. I like to start this one slightly below the bottom line, so in a way I guess you could consider this one a partial descender, but you can also do it within the same line if you want your letters to have all the same size. Now for the next set, we are still sticking with the I letter shape vertical pen stroke, but this time we're not finishing it with a serif, we're finishing it with a left flick, the most basic one being the letter J. You do that vertical stroke and flick and it's already ready. Next we have the letter F. Once again we're doing that J pen stroke, following it with 2 more pen strokes within the pen widths, both of them imitating the top pen stroke that we did on the letter K. This is actually one of those basic medieval calligraphy pen strokes that show up in pretty much every style. It is going from left to right on an arch, and because of the shape of the pen, you get that thin to thick progression. For the letter P, once again, we're starting with that J stroke, and then similar to the way we did that second stroke on the top of the F, this time we're just going to continue it all the way to the bottom line of your pen widths. And then for the R, very similarly, we're doing the same J stroke, the same curved line that we did for the P, except that this time we're doing it a bit shorter so that we have the space to do that final stroke, which is a flick very similar to what we did with the K. You still want to keep it within your pen widths and flick it up if you'd like to, and if you don't, just leave it where the main stroke ends. Continuing with these J strokes, we're going to do the letter N, starting out with a J just like we have started the previous set of letters. The second stroke is something similar to those last strokes on the K and on the R, where we're going diagonally. Actually, it's also similar to the letter A and the X, except that this time the top serif was already there from the first stroke. And then to come down, similar to the letter I and to the letter G, we do the top serif, bring it down, and then curve it a little bit to the left to connect it with the rest of the letter. The letter Y is kind of a combination of the A and the J, so we do have that diagonal like we did on the letter A, but then we're flicking the end towards the left, just like the letter J and the rest of these 2 lines that we've been working on. The second stroke of the Y is very reminiscent of what we did with the X, so bringing that thin diagonal up, curving it at the end, and then we are adding a dot to the Y. You can leave it without the dot if you prefer, but this is a way that it was done, and I really like the way it looks, especially since the I still didn't have a dot. This makes the page look way more dynamic. So now we're moving on to the second stroke that is the most used in Uncial. So the first one was that I letter stroke, and this one is what I'm going to call the O stroke. So it is those rounded lines where you go from thin to thick to thin again. For the O, we are doing this basic curve, and then the second stroke we're mirroring the exact same movement except the opposite side. You want to make sure you start and end your strokes where you started and ended the previous ones. One thing that helps to do this is when you do the first curve, start it a little bit below the top line of your pen widths, so that way you have the space to go up a little bit and you don't go above your designated measurements. For the letter C, with the first stroke is identical to the O, except that for the second stroke we're not connecting it entirely. We're doing it like that K and that F side strokes, leaving it open while the line is still thick. And then for the letter G, we're doing pretty much exactly the same as the C, except that we're flicking right after we do that first curve. I prefer to not lift my pen when I do this. The letter E starts once again with that first O curve, continued exactly like the C and the G, but this time we are adding that middle stroke that differentiates it from the previous two. I start this exactly on top of the middle line of my designated pen widths and go horizontally straight towards my right and flick it a little bit upwards once I go past the top curve. You can also not do that curve at the end if you'd like and just leave it with a sharp edge when you reach the end of that top curve. The letter D starts the same way as the previous four letters, except that this time we are going to start it on the top line of your designated measurement lines. And that's because, contrary to the rest, the next stroke does not start connected to that beginning stroke. It will start over the top line, slightly to the left of the stroke we already did, making it a bit of an ascender. With the letter M, we are basically putting multiple strokes that we have already learned together. We start off with that O curve, starting it slightly below the top measurement line, and then going back to where you started that stroke, we are going to do that I shape that we did in the beginning of our practice, ending with what essentially was the second stroke of the letter H, for example, or the O, where you do the same curve but to the other side, going from left to right. The letter Q also starts with the O curve, except that this time we're not continuing it with more curves. When we go back to the top of that first stroke, you want to do a very small, very short horizontal line directly from left to right, and then bring it down just like we did with the J, flicking it towards the left at the end. And now on to three letters that all look very similar to each other, U, V, and W. Starting with the U, we want to start it off with a serif similar to the I, but then doing a curve similar to the O. So once again, we are joining forces of these two very common strokes. Once you're done with that curve, you finish it off with pretty much exactly a letter I connected to the curve that you just did. For the V, we are starting with a stroke that is basically the same as the letter L, except that it is not an ascender this time. So we are sticking within the pen width measurements. And then for the second stroke, it's very similar to the last stroke of the letter M, except that this time it's a little sharper on the top, so that it gives that overall rounder look. And then for the W, this one I'm only doing once because it is essentially an exact blend of the U and the V. We start off with the first stroke the exact same way we did it for the U, and then essentially attach a V to it. Everything about it is exactly the same as those two letters. The V and the W, just like the letter J, which we already did, are actually not part of the Latin language alphabet. The design for the J does come directly from manuscripts because a lot of I's actually were made in a way that to us looks like a modern letter J. But with the V and the W, these are basically modern creations of what these letters would have looked like. Lastly, we have the section of the two letters that don't really match with the rest of these two general groups of letters, which is the S and the Z. For the S, we are starting with a horizontally curved line. You want to start this a bit above the middle line so that you have space within the pen width measurements to do the top and bottom pen stroke. So you want to pay attention to leaving the space both when starting and when ending that horizontal stroke. Then we are doing that same horizontal thin to thick curve that we have done in so many letters so far, each one of them on the top and bottom connecting to the ends of the horizontal curve. For the Z, you want to start directly on that top line of your measurements, pretty much touching it with the top corner of your pen, and you're going to do a slightly curved horizontal line, then bringing it down diagonally towards the left with a thin stroke, and ending it with a curved horizontal stroke, and that is the entire alphabet. So now let's put it to the test and do some calligraphy. I am writing an excerpt. It's actually the first page, translated to English of course, of the book City of God, which is a book that was originally written in the 5th century. So I figured it was very fitting to do it on this video. It is a religious text that condones other religions. I definitely did not pick it because of that. I do not think any religion is better than another. I am all for everybody practicing whatever you want to practice. I just picked this excerpt because it is from the century that we have been studying throughout this video. Also, it goes along with the history of this script of the Christian religion using it for their religious library, so I figured it matches very well with the overall topic of the video. That is all for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you at least learned a little bit and this motivates you in any way to do some calligraphy, whether it is this style or any other medieval or non-medieval style. I will leave you with the calligraphy and the music, and I'll see you soon with another video. Have a fantastic day. Bye!